Nettuno, Italy, February 7, 1944. A surgical tent inside the 95th Evacuation Hospital. A wounded American soldier lies on an operating table under a bare electric bulb, already anesthetized, his abdomen open. A team of surgeons and nurses bent over him in the concentrated silence of work that cannot be rushed and cannot be stopped. This place is a hospital in every sense the word is supposed to guarantee. Its tents are marked with red crosses large enough to be read from the air. It sits well back from the fighting line, on ground chosen precisely because it was judged the least dangerous option available. The men inside it are not fighting. They are the wounded, the ones already removed from the battle, and the people whose entire purpose is to put them back together. Everything about this position says safety, or as close to safety as a battlefield ever offers. And then, without any of the conditions that are supposed to precede violence against a place like this, a German aircraft passes overhead. It is not aiming at the hospital, it is being chased by Allied fighters, and to lighten itself and climb faster, it releases its bomb load early. 5 anti-personnel bombs fall away from it and drop toward the cluster of tents below. One of them strikes the surgical section directly. In an instant, 26 people are dead. Doctors, nurses, enlisted medics, patients who had already survived their wounds and were lying in recovery. 64 more are wounded a second time inside the very place that was meant to heal the first wound. The red crosses did not matter. The distance from the line did not matter. The careful selection of the safest ground did not matter. Now here is the detail that turns this from a tragedy into a genuine historical puzzle. That hospital, and every other hospital on that beachhead, kept working. It did not close. It did not pull back, because there was nowhere to pull back to. Within days, the wounded were flowing through the tents again in the hundreds, and the great majority of them lived. A soldier hit on that beachhead in the winter of 1944, torn open by shellfire in a place where the hospitals themselves were being shelled, had a better chance of surviving his wounds than a wounded man had ever had in the history of warfare up to that point. Both of those things were true at the same time and in the same square mile of Italian coast. The hospitals were under fire, and the wounded were surviving at rates no previous army had ever achieved. The soldiers on that beachhead had a name for the patch of ground where the hospitals stood. They called it Hell's Half Acre. Some of the wounded, once they could walk, chose to slip back toward the front line rather than stay in it, because at the front, a man could at least dig a hole and shoot back. In the hospital, he could only lie still and wait. So how does an army keep men alive, at record rates, inside a place its own soldiers would rather flee? The answer has almost nothing to do with the hospitals being protected, because they were not. It has to do with a quiet revolution in how the American army had decided to keep wounded men alive. A revolution assembled over years, out of pieces that individually looked ordinary and together changed what a wound meant. To understand it, you first have to understand why there was no safe place on that beachhead in the first place, and why the men who ran those hospitals knew it before they ever landed. Operation Shingle began in the dark early hours of January 22, 1944. The idea behind it was elegant on a map and brutal in practice. The Allied advance up the middle of Italy had ground to a halt in the mountains south of Rome, against a fortified German line anchored on the high ground around a monastery at Monte Cassino. Every attack up that line cost enormous casualties for tiny gains, so the Allied command reached for an old idea. Instead of pushing through the German line, go around it by sea, land a force far behind it, on the coast near 2 small towns called Anzio and Nettuno, roughly 33 miles south of Rome. Threaten the German rear, force the enemy to abandon his mountain line to deal with the new landing, and open the road to the capital. The landing itself went almost perfectly, which in hindsight was part of the problem. The 6th Corps, under Major General John Lucas, put ashore 2 divisions with remarkable ease. The Americans of the 3rd Infantry Division and the British 1st Division came ashore against almost nothing. Surprise was very nearly total. By the end of the first day, something like 36,000 men and more than 3,000 vehicles were on the beach, and the casualties for that first day were counted in dozens rather than the thousands the planners had feared. Winston Churchill, who had championed the operation, later wrote one of the most quoted lines of the entire Italian campaign about what happened next. He had hoped, he said, that they were hurling a wildcat onto the shore. Instead, all they got was a stranded whale. What he meant was that the force did not drive inland while the door stood open. It consolidated. It built up its beachhead and prepared careful defenses instead of racing for the hills that commanded the plain. Historians have argued about that decision for 80 years, and it is not the subject of this account, but its consequence is. Because while the Allies built up on the beach, the German commander in Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, did exactly what a good commander does. He moved with astonishing speed. Within hours he had set contingency plans in motion. Within days he had assembled the equivalent of a whole army, under General Eberhard von Mackensen, and thrown a ring of steel around the beachhead. By the end of the first week the opportunity was gone, and the Allied force found itself sealed into a shallow pocket of coast with its back to the sea. Look closely at the shape of that pocket, because the shape is the whole story. At its fullest, the beachhead was only about 15 miles wide and no more than 7 miles deep. 7 miles. A man could drive across the entire depth of it, from the front line to the water where the supply ships unloaded, in a matter of minutes. And ringing the inland edge of that shallow pocket, the Germans held the high ground. To the northeast rose the Alban Hills, a mass of old volcanic slopes climbing to more than 3,000 feet at their highest peak, and from those heights German observers could look down across the flat coastal plain like men looking at the surface of a table. There was no fold of ground the Allies held that those observers could not see into. There was no corner of that beachhead that German artillery could not reach. The official United States Army medical history described the situation in a single devastating sentence. Every inch of it, it said, was under German artillery fire. Nobody was safe. Read that again and hold on to it, because it is the key to everything that follows. In a normal campaign, a hospital is placed in the rear. The word rear means something specific. It means far enough back that enemy guns cannot reach it, a zone of relative safety where a wounded man can be carried out of danger to be treated. At Anzio there was no rear. The official historians gave the beachhead a phrase that captures the impossibility of it perfectly. They called it a front without a rear, where the hospitals stood only about 6 miles from the fighting lines and were backed against the sea. The whole beachhead was the front. The place you carried a wounded man to be safe was inside the same killing zone as the place he had been wounded, and the ground itself made everything worse. This coastal strip had been reclaimed marshland, the Pontine Marshes, drained only in the years before the war. The water table sat just beneath the surface. Try to dig a proper deep foxhole or a dug-in shelter for a hospital, and it filled with water before you were waist deep. For the first weeks, until the ground dried in spring, men could not dig themselves properly into the earth to escape the shelling. They lived on top of ground that every German gunner on the heights could see. The soldiers developed a way of walking on that beachhead, a low, fast, flinching movement between one bit of cover and the next. They called it the Anzio amble or the Anzio shuffle, and it was the walk of men who knew that a shell could arrive at any second from guns they could not see and could not answer. Into this pocket, this front without a rear, the medical units had to place their hospitals. And here we come to a decision that sounds insane on its face, and was in fact the least bad option available. The corpse surgeon had to choose where to put the evacuation hospitals that would receive the wounded. Every location was under fire. The towns of Anzio and Nettuno themselves were obvious targets, and were steadily pounded into rubble. The port was a target. The ammunition dumps were targets. The airfield was a target. So the surgeon chose an open field about 2 miles east of Nettuno, a flat expanse away from the towns, and the medical service concentrated its hospitals there in the open. The official history's judgment on this choice is stark. Placing the hospitals in that open field, it concluded, undoubtedly saved the beachhead medical service, because the alternative sites were destroyed. The safest place was the open field, precisely because it was not a building the Germans wanted to flatten. But the open field had its own curse. It could not help but sit near other things the Germans very much did want to destroy. It lay within reach of ammunition dumps, the harbour, anti-aircraft positions, and the airstrip. And so, again and again, German bombers aiming at those military targets would miss, and their bombs would walk across the hospital tents instead. The forward positions were shelled because they were the front. The rear, such as it was shelled because the hospitals sat cheek by jowl with the things worth shelling. There was no geometry of safety anywhere on that beachhead. This is the tightly compressed, deadly little world into which the American medical system was about to be dropped, and the reason its survival is so remarkable is that it survived a situation designed, almost perfectly, to make survival impossible. Let us give the enemy his due, because the German artillery that ringed Anzio was not improvised harassment. It was a serious, professional weight of fire, delivered by one of the most competent artillery arms in the world. And to understand why the hospitals should not have been able to function, you have to understand the guns that were trying to stop them. The most famous of those guns has passed into legend, and like most legends, it needs to be handled carefully. The Germans deployed 2 enormous railway guns to the hills behind Anzio, massive Krupp-built pieces of a caliber of 280 mm, each mounted on its own railway carriage, because no wheeled vehicle on Earth could move something that size. The Germans named the 2 guns Leopold and Robert. The Allied soldiers on the receiving end gave them names that stuck harder, Anzio Annie and the Anzio Express. Each gun could hurl a shell weighing over 500 pounds across a distance of more than 30 miles. These railway guns opened fire on the beachhead in the first week of February 1944. What made these railway guns so maddening was not just their size, but their trick of disappearing. The Germans kept them inside a railway tunnel in the hills near the town of Ciampino. When it was time to fire, a locomotive would roll the gun out of the tunnel mouth into the open. The crew would lay it, load it, and fire, and then before Allied aircraft or counter-battery fire could find and destroy it, the locomotive would haul the whole gun back into the solid rock of the tunnel where no bomb could reach it. The crews at Anzio reportedly cut this cycle down from around 7 minutes to about 4, firing off a handful of rounds and vanishing back into the mountain before anyone could pin them down. Soldiers who heard the huge shells passing overhead described the sound in strange, homely terms, one veteran comparing it to a large cook stove tumbling end over end through the sky. But here is where the legend must yield to the truth, and getting this right is part of telling the story honestly. The giant railway guns were terrifying and famous, but they were not what did most of the killing. The official United States Army Ordnance history is blunt about it. The railway guns, it concluded, were essentially freaks. The real, grinding, daily damage across the beachhead came from more numerous and more practical weapons. Above all, the German 170 mm guns positioned on the surrounding hills. Those guns had a range of around 30,000 yards, and crucially, that range outreached the best gun the Allies had to answer them, the American 155 mm piece, nicknamed the Long Tom. The Germans could stand back at a distance and strike the beachhead while remaining beyond the reach of the guns firing back. On the day in February, the Germans opened their big counteroffensive. 6 of those 170 mm guns fired more than 450 rounds into the beachhead, while the railway guns managed only about 50 between them. It was the workmanlike heavy guns on the heights, not the monsters in the tunnel, that turned Anzio into a place under constant, observed, accurate fire. And that word observed is the heart of the threat. Because the Germans sat on the high ground and looked down, their fire was not blind. Their observers could see where shells were landing and correct them onto a target. So good, the official historians concluded, was their observation, and so accurate their marksmanship, that it was impossible to attribute all the damage in the hospital area to accident. Sit with the weight of that sentence. It is a careful, professional historian's way of saying something very dark. Some of the hospital hits were genuine accidents, bombs meant for the ammunition dump or the harbour, but not all of them. The observation was too good and the shooting too accurate for every strike on those clearly marked tents to have been chance. This is a question we will return to, because it deserves an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. For now, hold the tactical reality in your mind. A cluster of hospital tents, marked with red crosses, sitting in the open on flat ground, under the eyes of expert observers on the heights, within range of guns that outreach the Allied artillery, next door to the most valuable targets on the beachhead. By every rule of war, as it had been understood for a century, medicine could not function in a place like that. Wounded men could not be safely gathered there, and yet they were, and most of them lived. If accounts like this one matter to you, the forgotten machinery behind how men actually survived a war that the standard histories rush past, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of careful history reach the people who care about getting it right. So we arrive at the puzzle in its sharpest form. 6 weeks before that bomb fell on the 95th Evacuation Hospital, and for months after, the same basic situation held. The hospitals were within range. The hospitals were observed. The hospitals were, on multiple documented occasions, hit. Nurses were killed in their tents. Patients were killed in their beds, wounded a second time after already surviving the wound that brought them in. And through all of it, the flow of wounded men through those tents did not stop, and the proportion of them who lived climbed to a height no army in history had reached. Why? Why did Shellfire that should have shut down American medicine on that beachhead fail to stop it? The answer is not that the Americans were braver under fire than anyone else, though the courage was real, and we will honor it. The answer is not that the hospitals found some clever safe corner, because there was none. The answer is that keeping a wounded man alive had quietly stopped being a question of where you treated him, and had become a question of a system, a chain of linked pieces built over years, each one designed to buy back some fraction of the survival that a wound steals. That system did not need the hospital to be safe. It only needed the hospital to keep functioning for the length of time it took to move a man through it, and it had been engineered, piece by unglamorous piece, to do exactly that. To understand why the Shellfire failed, you have to understand the 4 things the Americans had built, and you have to start with the one that mattered most, the one that had almost nothing to do with surgery at all. You have to start with blood. For most of the history of war, the great killer of the wounded was not the wound itself, but what the wound did to the body afterward. A man torn open by a shell fragment does not usually die from the hole. He dies from shock, from the catastrophic loss of blood that follows, from the collapse of blood pressure that starves his organs and stops his heart, while the wound itself is still, in theory, survivable. For centuries, there was almost nothing medicine could do about this. A surgeon could be brilliant and fast and still lose a man on the table because there was simply not enough blood left in him to keep him alive long enough for the surgery to matter. Blood loss set a hard ceiling on how many wounded men could ever be saved, and no amount of surgical skill could raise it. The First World War had begun to crack the problem. Doctors learned that transfusing blood into a bleeding man could pull him back from shock. But blood is difficult. It spoils. It has to be matched to type, or it kills the patient it was meant to save. It has to be kept cold. In the field conditions of the earlier war, reliable transfusion at scale was nearly impossible, and much of what could be done relied on donors present on the spot, a soldier lying down beside the wounded man to give his own blood directly, vein to vein. That is heroic, and it does not scale. You cannot run an army's worth of casualties through a system that depends on finding a matching donor at the moment of crisis. Between the wars and into the early years of the Second World War, a series of advances chipped at this. One was plasma, the pale fluid part of blood with the cells removed. Plasma could be dried into a powder, stored almost indefinitely, shipped anywhere, and reconstituted with sterile water at the front, and it did not need to be matched to blood type. The American Red Cross ran an enormous civilian donor program, ultimately collecting more than 13 million pints of blood over the course of the war, much of it processed into plasma that flowed to the battlefields. Plasma saved a great many lives, and it was a genuine breakthrough, and it had one crucial limitation that the doctors understood well. Plasma restores the volume of fluid in a man's veins, which fights shock, but it carries no red cells. It cannot carry oxygen. For a man who has lost a moderate amount of blood, plasma can be enough to hold him. For a man who has been truly gutted, who has lost great quantities of blood, plasma alone is a temporary reprieve. What that man needs is the real thing. He needs whole blood, red cells and all, to carry oxygen to his starving tissues. And whole blood was the hard problem, because whole blood is exactly the thing that spoils and must be kept cold and must be matched. The lesson that American surgeons had drawn from the fighting in North Africa and in Sicily, in the campaigns just before Italy, was that whole blood was indispensable for the worst cases, and that plasma alone was not enough to save the men who were bleeding to death. So the American Medical Service set out to do something that had never been done at scale before. It set out to build a supply chain that could deliver fresh, refrigerated, type-matched whole blood, in quantity, to the edge of a battlefield, reliably, day after day. Not donors on the spot, not a lucky match, an industrial pipeline of blood flowing from banks in the rear all the way forward to the operating tables, treated like ammunition, resupplied like ammunition, expected to be there when the surgeon reached for it. At Anzio you can watch that pipeline arrive and take hold. In the earliest days, the beachhead leaned partly on a British field transfusion unit and a British blood bank for its whole blood, the two allied medical services helping each other under the same guns. Then, in late February 1944, the American side of the pipeline reached the beach. A newly organized blood bank at Naples began shipping whole blood forward to Anzio, and it kept shipping it. Between late February and late May, more than 5,000 pints of American whole blood came across from that Naples bank alone, carried forward mostly by the same tank landing ships that hauled the beachhead's other supplies, with emergency runs by light aircraft when the need outran the schedule. Across the whole span of the beachhead fighting, the American hospitals put more than 10,000 pints of whole blood into wounded men, an average of about 2 pints for every case that needed it. Think about what that meant on the operating table inside a shelled tent. A man comes in gutted, his blood pressure crashing, and the old ceiling of blood loss pressing down on him, the point at which, in any earlier war, the surgeon would have lost him no matter how skilled. But now there is a rack of cold, matched whole blood at hand, resupplied that morning off a landing ship. The team pours it into him, buys back his blood pressure, lifts him up off the floor of shock, and holds him there long enough for the surgery to do its work. The wound that would have been fatal in the First World War, fatal even in the opening campaigns of this one, becomes survivable. And crucially, none of that machinery cared whether the tent it happened in was safe. The blood pipeline did not require a rear area. It only required that landing ships keep reaching the beach and that the tent keep standing for the length of an operation. The Germans could shell the beachhead all they liked. As long as the blood kept coming and the surgeons kept working, the ceiling on survival kept rising. This was the first and greatest reason the Shellfire could not stop the hospitals. The thing that actually saved the wounded was not the safety of the building. It was a river of blood flowing up from Naples, and you cannot shell a river into stopping. But blood is only useful if there is a surgeon and a table waiting close enough to use it before the man bleeds out. And that brings us to the second piece of the system, a piece the beachhead itself forced into its most extreme form. In an ordinary campaign, medical care is arranged in a series of steps stretching back from the front. A wounded man is patched at an aid station near the line, carried back to a clearing station, then further back again to a field hospital for urgent surgery, then further still to a large evacuation hospital in the safe rear for definitive care, and finally, perhaps, all the way back to a general hospital far behind the lines. Each step is further from the danger and better equipped than the last. The whole logic depends on distance, on there being a deep space behind the front through which a man can be moved rearward, getting safer and better cared for at every stage. At Anzio, that deep space did not exist. There was no rear to move a man back into. The evacuation hospitals sat only about 6 miles behind the line, which on that beachhead meant they were as far forward as the clearing stations would be anywhere else. The entire elaborate rearward chain was compressed into a space 7 miles deep, all of it under fire. And so the American Medical Service did something that the terrain forced upon it, and that turned out to be, in its own grim way, an advantage. At Anzio, all surgery was forward surgery. The words come straight from the official account, and they mean something precise. There was no safe rear hospital to send the worst cases to, so the capacity to perform major surgery had to exist right there, at the forward hospitals, within range of the guns. The most difficult, most urgent operations, the ones that in another campaign would have waited for the big hospital in the rear, had to be done immediately, close to the line, on men too badly hurt to be moved any further. To do that, the army leaned on a specialized formation whose whole reason for existing was to bring first-class surgery forward to where the wounded were. It was called the 2nd Auxiliary Surgical Group, and it worked in a way worth understanding, because it is a beautiful piece of medical engineering. Rather than fixed hospitals with fixed staffs, the Auxiliary Surgical Group was a pool of specialized surgical teams, each a small self-contained unit of surgeon, assistants, and nurse, that could be sent wherever the need was greatest and plugged into whatever hospital required them. Teams of this group operated in every hospital on the beachhead, including the British ones, sharing their expertise across the whole medical front. When a wave of casualties hit, these teams turned the forward evacuation hospitals into something with the surgical power of a rear hospital, right there in the danger zone. The workload those teams carried is almost hard to believe. In a single month, one evacuation hospital on the beachhead handled well over 1,000 surgical cases with its own staff. In one stretch of 11 days, another handled more than 1,200. On one brutal day, a hospital performed 138 operations in 24 hours with the help of 4 of the auxiliary teams. That is a surgery begun, on average, every 10 minutes, around the clock, for a full day, inside a tent on a beachhead under observed artillery fire. The surgical teams were not spared the cost of where they worked. The 2nd Auxiliary Surgical Group lost men killed and wounded at Anzio, surgeons and nurses among them, struck down in the act of operating on other wounded men. But the principle held. By bringing the surgery forward instead of trying to send the man rearward to safety that did not exist, the system removed the need for a safe rear entirely. You did not have to move the wounded man out of danger. You brought the full power of surgery to him, inside the danger, and you did it fast enough and well enough that he lived anyway. There was a particular refinement to this forward surgery that deserves its own moment, because it addressed the single most feared complication of battlefield wounds, and it did so through discipline rather than through any wonder drug. The terror of dirty wounds in warfare is infection, and above all gas gangrene, a savage infection of torn muscle that can kill a man in days and was one of the great murderers of the wounded in the First World War. The American surgeons at Anzio controlled it not primarily with medicine, but with technique, through rigorous surgical cleaning of wounds. The method was to open the wound wide, cut away every scrap of dead and damaged tissue that infection could feed on, remove the dirt and fragments and shreds of uniform driven into the flesh, and then, and this was the disciplined and counterintuitive part, to leave the wound open rather than sewing it shut. A wound closed up tight over hidden dead tissue is a sealed breeding ground for gangrene. A wound left open, cleaned thoroughly, and closed only later once it was clearly healthy, denied the infection the airless pocket it needed. This practice, refined through careful study in the campaigns just before Anzio, was one of the great quiet lifesavers of the war, and it required no supply line at all, only trained surgeons doing the unglamorous work correctly every single time. Here we have to pause and correct something, because getting it right is the difference between an honest account and a comfortable myth, and this account intends to be honest. Many popular retellings of wartime medicine reach for penicillin at exactly this moment. They tell you that the miracle antibiotic swept in and saved the wounded, and they place it triumphantly at every battle of 1944. The truth at Anzio, in the winter and early spring of that year, is more careful than that. Penicillin was real, and it was coming, and it would become one of the great lifesavers of the later war. But in early 1944, it was still desperately scarce. Mass production was only just beginning to ramp up, and the drug was tightly rationed, not yet flowing freely to forward hospitals. The mainstay of infection control at the front on that beachhead was not penicillin. It was the older family of sulfur drugs, sulfur powder shaken into wounds and sulfur tablets, combined with that rigorous surgical cleaning. One American soldier wounded at Anzio remembered it precisely. Penicillin, he recalled, was not used at that point, but sulfur powder did an adequate job of sterilizing the wounds. The full arrival of battlefield penicillin in American hands is really a story of the summer of 1944 and after, of the Normandy invasion in June and the months that followed, not of the Anzio winter. To claim otherwise would be to get the history wrong, and the real history is remarkable enough without borrowing a miracle from the wrong season. So we have blood flowing up from Naples, and forward surgery bringing the operating table into the danger zone. The third piece of the system answered a different question. Once a man had been stabilized and operated on, once the immediate crisis was past, what then? On a normal front, you would move him rearward to recover in safety. At Anzio, there was no rearward on land. The only way out was the way everyone had come in, by sea. And so the third piece of the machine was evacuation by water, a steady ferrying of the wounded off the beachhead and back down the coast to the great base hospitals around Naples, where they could recover far from the guns. This was its own extraordinary operation, run under fire the whole way. There were never enough proper hospital ships, those large vessels painted white and marked with red crosses and reserved for carrying the wounded. So the army pressed its workhorse landing ships into service. The same tank landing ships that carried blood and ammunition up to the beach would carry the wounded back down, fitted out with medical supplies and staffed by medical platoons for the voyage. Each run took most of a day, 20 to 30 hours down to Naples, carrying something like 100 or more litter cases and as many walking wounded on each trip. The rhythm of it was relentless. Casualties flowed off the ships from Naples going up, and flowed onto them going back down, in a continuous circulation. Across the 4 months of the beachhead, this sea bridge carried more than 33,000 American and British casualties safely off Anzio and back to the base hospitals. That is the scale of a small city, moved out through a single small port, under observed fire, one shipload at a time. The evacuation was not safe, and the enemy did not always respect the markings that were supposed to make it safe. On the very first night of unloading, 3 clearly marked and clearly lit British hospital ships lying off the beachhead were attacked from the air. One of them, a vessel serving as a hospital ship, was struck and sank within minutes, some 20-odd miles off Anzio. Of the more than 200 people aboard her, nearly 100 were killed, among them the ship's master and the senior army surgeon aboard, both lost with the ship. 2 American army nurses aboard survived, and one of them had already survived the bombing of a different hospital ship months earlier at Salerno. The men who ran the evacuation were killed doing it. A beachhead evacuation officer among them struck down while loading the wounded onto a landing ship for the trip to safety. But the sea bridge never broke. There was one stretch of about 2 weeks when no proper hospital ship reached the beachhead at all, and still the landing ships carried the wounded out. As long as the coast lay open and the ships kept running, no wounded man was trapped on that beachhead. The exit did not depend on a safe road, because there was no safe road. It depended on the sea, and the Germans, for all their guns on the heights, could not close the sea. Now step back and see the 4 pieces working together as one machine, because the power of it is in the combination and not in any single part. A man is hit at the front, torn open, bleeding, sliding toward the shock that would have killed him in any earlier war. He is patched and carried back the short distance to a forward evacuation hospital, 6 miles, minutes, not the long rearward journey of a normal front. That hospital is under the same guns that wounded him, but it does not matter, because everything he needs is already there. A surgical team from the auxiliary group is waiting. Forward surgery brought into the danger zone. Cold, matched whole blood, shipped up from Naples that morning, is on hand to buy back his blood pressure and lift him out of shock. His wound is cleaned with disciplined thoroughness and dosed with sulfur and left open against gangrene. And once he is stable, the sea bridge carries him back down the coast to a base hospital far from the guns to recover. Blood, forward surgery, wound discipline, sea evacuation. Not one of those four things required the hospital to be safe. Every one of them was designed to keep a man alive while the hospital itself was in danger. That is why the Shellfire could not stop the hospitals. The Germans were trying to win by making the place unsafe, and the Americans had built a way of saving men that no longer depended on the place being safe at all. The result showed up in the coldest and most reliable measure there is, the proportion of wounded men who died of their wounds after reaching a hospital. Across the Second World War, for American forces, that figure fell to somewhere around 4.5 in every 100. In the First World War, it had been roughly double that. Half as many of the wounded who reached care were dying, and the single greatest driver of that improvement, the medical historians concluded, was exactly what Anzio put on display, the prompt resuscitation of the badly wounded, with whole blood and plasma, right at the forward hospitals. The system was not a theory. It was a measurable, countable saving of lives, and it was working at its fullest expression in the one place on the whole Italian front where, by every older rule, medicine should not have been able to work at all. Consider the sheer volume that flowed through this machine, because scale is part of the proof. Across the 4 months of the beachhead, from the landing in late January to the breakout in late May, the American hospitals on that cramped patch of ground admitted more than 33,000 patients. Of those, roughly 11,000 were battle wounds, the torn and broken men who came straight from the fighting line. Several thousand more were injuries of other kinds, and the largest share of all were sickness, the diseases that thrive when tens of thousands of men live in waterlogged holes through an Italian winter under constant strain. The British hospitals handled many thousands more. All of it passed through a handful of tented hospitals, standing in the open, in a field 2 miles from a town, under the eyes of gunners on the hills. There was no lull in which to catch up. The wounded arrived when the fighting surged, in waves that could swamp a hospital in an afternoon, and the teams simply worked until the wave was through and then braced for the next one. Set that against the strategic backdrop, because it tells you why the pressure never eased. This was not a quiet holding operation. In February 1944, the Germans launched a series of massive counterattacks aimed at splitting the beachhead in two and driving the whole force back into the sea. For days, the perimeter bent and nearly broke, the fighting reaching a pitch that veterans compared to the worst of the First World War. Every one of those days of crisis at the front translated directly into a flood of torn men at the hospitals in the rear that was not a rear. The medical system was tested not in calm, but at the exact moment the whole beachhead teetered on the edge of collapse, and it held even then. When the survival statistics say that most of the wounded lived, they are describing men saved during a battle for survival, in hospitals that were themselves being hit, at the worst possible moment for the machine to be asked to perform. That is the measure of what had been built. Let us not turn that into something bloodless, because the people who made it work were not machinery, and their courage is not a footnote to the logistics. Consider what it actually asked of them. To go on operating, deliberately, calmly, with your hands inside another man's body, while shells land near enough to shake the ground and tear the canvas over your head, is a kind of courage that has no obvious name. The nurses and surgeons of Hell's Half-Acre did it for months, and the price they paid was real and specific, and the record preserves their names, which is the least that history owes them. Return to that day, February 10th, 1944, when long-range guns walked their fire into the hospital area. Shells struck the 33rd Field Hospital. 2 nurses were killed, one of them, the unit's chief nurse. One shell killed 2 off-duty nurses who had simply met to borrow a book from each other, an act so ordinary it makes the death almost unbearable to think about. Another shell destroyed the generator that powered the operating tent and started a fire. And in the middle of that, the staff carried on. They evacuated dozens of patients from the burning, shelled hospital by flashlight, moving helpless men on their mattresses across open ground under fire to the neighboring hospital. There is a detail from that night that says everything about the discipline these people had. Blood transfusions that were running into patients at the moment the attack began were not stopped during the move. One attendant held the needle in place in the patient's vein, while another held the bottle aloft, and they carried the wounded man, still receiving his transfusion, out of the danger. The system did not pause even to flee. It walked the blood out under fire rather than break the flow. For their conduct that night, and in the days around it, 4 American Army nurses were awarded the Silver Star, the first time in the history of the United States that women received that decoration for valor. First Lieutenant Mary Roberts, the chief operating room nurse of an evacuation hospital, kept her surgical team working through a barrage that lasted half an hour. Second Lieutenant Elaine Rowe and Second Lieutenant Rita Rourke were among those who evacuated 42 patients by flashlight from the burning field hospital. And Second Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth directed the moving of 42 surgical patients to safety, calming them, getting them onto the ground and out of the line of fire, before she herself was struck in the chest by a shell fragment. She died of her wound 6 days later, on February 16, 1944. Her Silver Star was awarded after her death. Mary Roberts, as the senior of them, holds the distinction of being the first woman decorated for heroism in action in her country's history, and Major General Lucas pinned the medals on the survivors on the beachhead itself later that same month. Listen to their own words, because they are plainer and truer than any narration. One of the nurses described the strange process of learning what the sounds meant. They heard so many shells whistling over the tent, she said, that when the first one landed she paid it no attention. Then the second one came, and it was the patients, the veteran soldiers lying wounded in the cots, who told her what she was hearing. "Go to the foxholes," they told her. "That is incoming mail." The wounded men were teaching the nurse how to survive, and Mary Roberts described the reflex she had to fight in the operating tent, the animal urge to dive under the operating table for cover, and how the work came first. Before anyone could take cover, she remembered, they had to lower the men who could not move, the litter cases, down to the floor where they would be safer. She recalled seeing that a patient on the operating table had his helmet lying beside him, and reaching over to put the helmet on the anesthetized man's head, to give him at least that much protection, before she could think about her own. 6 American Army nurses died on that beachhead. When the fighting was at its worst in February, the 5th Army Command actually considered pulling the nurses off Anzio entirely, to spare them. The idea was rejected, and the reasoning is worth remembering. The presence of the nurses was judged to be of incalculable value to the morale of the wounded men, and to remove them, the command concluded, would have been very close to an admission of defeat. The nurses themselves wanted to stay, so they stayed, in hell's half-acre, under the guns, and they went on holding needles in veins while the canvas shook. When you tally the whole cost to the medical service, it is sobering. Across the beachhead, the medical department counted 92 of its people killed, including those 6 nurses, along with hundreds wounded and others captured or missing, well over 500 casualties in total, among the very people whose job was to heal casualties. That is the true face of a hospital that keeps working under fire. It is not that the fire missed, it is that the people kept working while the fire found them. If this account is holding your attention, a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means the next deep dive into the parts of this war that the standard histories skate past will find its way to you. Now let us turn to the hardest question in this whole story, the one the official historians raised and did not fully answer, and let us try to answer it honestly. Were the hospitals deliberately targeted? It is a heavy accusation, and the honest response is that the evidence points in 2 directions at once, and a careful account has to hold both. On one side stands everything that argues for tragic accident. The hospital field sat, unavoidably, beside the most bombed targets on the beachhead, the ammunition dumps, and the harbour and the airstrip. Bombers aiming at those and missing would inevitably savage the tents nearby. The single worst incident, the bomb that killed 26 people at the 95th Evacuation Hospital on February 7th, was demonstrably not a deliberate strike at all. It came from a German aircraft being chased by Allied fighters, jettisoning its bombs to escape, its load happening to fall across the hospital. That is a horror, but it is the horror of a compressed battlefield, not of a decision to murder the wounded. In a pocket 7 miles deep, packed with targets, some hospital hits were the grim arithmetic of geography. But the other side of the evidence cannot be waved away, and the official historians were too careful to wave it away. The Germans held the high ground. Their observers could see the beachhead laid out beneath them in detail. Their gunnery was expert, their corrections precise. And it was on the strength of exactly that observation and that accuracy that the official history reached its uncomfortable conclusion, that it was simply not possible to attribute all of the damage in the hospital area to accident. When guns that accurate, directed by observers that good, strike clearly marked hospital tents repeatedly, over months, chance alone strains to explain all of it. The commander of one of the American formations, General Truscott, became convinced that a particular shelling of one evacuation hospital in March was deliberate, and he ordered the engineers to dig the hospitals in and revet them with earth in response. And behind all of it lay the plain strategic fact that the German High Command wanted this beachhead eliminated. Hitler himself had called it an abscess to be lanced. In a battle of annihilation against a sealed pocket, the line between a legitimate military target and the hospital sitting next to it grows terribly thin. The honest verdict, the one the evidence actually supports, is neither of the comfortable extremes. It is not true that the Germans ran a deliberate campaign to slaughter the wounded, and anyone who tells you so has gone beyond the evidence. It is also not true that every hospital strike was pure accident, and the official historians themselves refuse to say so. The truth is that the hospitals were hit by both, by bombs and shells that missed their intended targets, and by fire that the quality of German observation makes impossible to fully excuse as chance. That ambiguity is uncomfortable, and it is where the honest evidence leaves us, and it would be a betrayal of the people who died there to resolve it more neatly than the facts allow. What is not ambiguous, what stands completely beyond dispute, is the outcome. Whether by accident or intent, the beachhead hospitals were struck again and again over 4 months, and the wounded kept flowing through them, and the wounded kept surviving. That is the fact that no shell changed. And it points us toward the deepest meaning of this whole story, the reframe that turns a grim episode of endurance into something genuinely important about how the modern world learned to save lives. For all of recorded military history up to this point, the safety of a hospital and the survival of its patients had been the same question. A hospital kept men alive by being a sanctuary, a place removed from danger, and if you took away the sanctuary, you took away the survival with it. Put a hospital under fire, and it ceased to be a hospital in any useful sense, because its entire method of saving life was to be somewhere the killing was not. Distance was the medicine, safety was the treatment. This assumption was so old and so total that no one thought to question it, because until the 20th century it was simply true. What happened at Anzio, quietly, under the guns, was that this ancient equation was broken. The American Medical Service had, without quite intending to make a philosophical point, separated the survival of the wounded from the safety of the place. It had built survival into a mobile, resupplied, integrated system, blood that flowed up a pipeline, surgery that could be carried forward into danger, wounds managed by disciplined technique rather than by a safe environment, and an evacuation that ran by sea when the land offered no rear. Each piece was engineered to function inside the danger zone, and so, for the first time, a hospital could be one of the most dangerous places on a battlefield and still be one of the most effective at keeping men alive. Safety and survival had come apart. You no longer needed the first to achieve the second. That is the real reason German shellfire could not stop American hospitals at Anzio, and it is worth stating as plainly as possible, because it is the whole point. The Germans were fighting the old war, in which you defeat enemy medicine by denying it a safe place to work. They ringed the beachhead, they took the heights, they made every inch of it dangerous, and by every rule they had grown up with that should have shut the hospitals down. But the Americans were no longer playing that game. They had stopped needing the safe place. Their system did not have a single point the Germans could threaten, because it was not a place at all. It was a flow, blood up from Naples, wounded down to Naples, surgery riding forward to meet the casualties wherever they fell. You cannot besiege a flow. You cannot capture the high ground over a system that has no fixed ground to defend. The Germans could make the hospitals dangerous, and they did, at a terrible cost in nurses and surgeons and patients. What they could not do was make the hospitals stop, because stopping them would have required threatening something that was no longer there to threaten. This was not a triumph of individual genius, and it is important to resist the temptation to make it one. No single inventor, no lone hero, built the thing that saved those men. It was the accumulated output of years of unglamorous institutional work by people whose names mostly do not survive. It was the Red Cross donor drives and the blood chemists who worked out how to bank and ship whole blood. It was the doctrine writers who invented the auxiliary surgical group so that surgery could travel. It was the surgeons in North Africa and Sicily who studied wounds and worked out that you leave them open and clean them hard. It was the logisticians who fitted out landing ships to carry the wounded and kept the sea bridge running under fire. Not one of those efforts on its own would have saved that beachhead's wounded. It was their combination, all of it arriving in the same 7-mile pocket at the same time, that broke the old equation. The Germans had excellent artillery, excellent observers, and excellent guns on excellent ground. What they did not have, and what no army had built before, was an answer to the question of how to keep the wounded alive after you have lost the luxury of a safe place to treat them. And here lies the quiet irony that closes the story. The German army was, in many respects, a superb practitioner of war, and its artillery arm was among the best in the world. On that beachhead, the Germans did nearly everything their profession asked of them. They reacted with speed, they seized the commanding ground, they brought up heavy guns that outranged their enemy, they observed with skill and shot with accuracy, and they made a small pocket of Italian coast into one of the most dangerous places on earth. By the standards of the war they had been trained to fight, they were winning the contest over that ground, and it did not matter, because the thing they were trying to defeat had changed its nature while they were not looking. They were laying siege to a sanctuary that no longer needed to be a sanctuary. They were trying to deny a safe place to a medical system that had stopped requiring one. Every shell that fell on Hell's half-acre was, in a sense, aimed at an idea that the Americans had already abandoned. The idea that you save the wounded by keeping them safe. The wounded American soldier on the operating table where this account began, under the bare bulb in the shelled tent, lived in most cases not because anyone protected him, but because a river of blood had reached him from Naples that morning, because a surgical team had come forward into the danger to meet him, because his wound was cleaned by a discipline refined on earlier battlefields, and because a ship would carry him out by sea when the work was done. The red crosses on the tent did not save him, and the Germans, whether by accident or intent, did not always spare them. What saved him was a system built to work in exactly the place where the old rules said medicine could not work at all. The nurses who died holding needles in veins, the surgeons who operated through the barrages, the ships that ran the gauntlet of the coast, together they proved something that has shaped every war since. A hospital does not have to be safe to save your life. It only has to keep working. And at Anzio, under the worst guns the enemy could bring to bear, it kept working. If this account gave you something to carry away, something about how survival is engineered and not merely granted, then hit the like button and subscribe. It is how accounts like this one reach the people who care about understanding the history rather than just hearing it.